A pregnant wife lies on a ballroom floor, surrounded by shattered Christmas ornaments and 300 silent witnesses. Her billionaire husband just kicked her in front of every camera in the room. He thinks he's untouchable. He thinks money can erase anything. But he does not know that the man in the Santa suit walking through those doors is about to destroy everything he has ever built. What happens next will shock you. If you love stories of betrayal, revenge, and justice served cold, hit that subscribe button and stay until the end. Trust me, you do not want to miss this twist. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Let us begin. The ballroom of the Riviera Grand Hotel glittered with the kind of wealth that demanded to be noticed. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across 300 guests in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, all gathered beneath a 12-foot Christmas tree, dripping with ornaments worth more than most people's cars. Caroline Webb Hargrove stood near the entrance, one hand resting on her 7-month pregnant belly, the other clutching a glass of sparkling water she had no intention of drinking. Her ice blue gown caught the light beautifully, and anyone watching would have seen a woman who belonged in this world. They would have been wrong. She spotted her husband across the room immediately. Preston Hargrove stood at the center of a circle of investors, his laugh too loud, his hand resting on the lower back of his executive assistant. Vanessa Cole, the woman in the crimson dress, leaned into him with the comfort of someone who had done it many times before. Carolyn had stopped pretending she did not see these things months ago. Preston is hosting this party, she reminded herself. He is allowed to mingle with his employees. But even her own internal excuses had grown tired. She touched the clutch purse at her side, feeling the hard edge of her old law school ID card through the fabric. She carried it everywhere now, a reminder of the woman she used to be before she traded her career for this gilded cage. Preston finally noticed her. His smile did not reach his eyes as he excused himself from the group and walked toward her with the deliberate stride of a man who owned every room he entered. His cologne arrived before he did. That sharp, expensive scent that once had meant safety now only meant control. "Smile," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You look like you are about to cry, and I will not have you embarrassing me tonight." "I am fine," Caroline said quietly. "Then act like it." His fingers closed around her elbow, squeezing just hard enough to remind her who was in charge. "The Hendersons are here. They are considering a $50 million investment. If you cannot be charming, at least be invisible." He released her and walked away without waiting for a response. Caroline exhaled slowly, her heart pounding. She had learned to make herself small in this marriage, to fold her opinions into silence, to pretend the bruises on her arms came from her own clumsiness. But tonight felt different, and tonight something inside her was cracking. She needed air. She made her way toward the ladies' room, nodding politely at faces she vaguely recognized. The hallway was quieter, the noise of the party muffled behind heavy oak doors. Inside the bathroom, she gripped the marble counter and stared at her reflection. Her makeup was flawless. Her hair was professionally styled. Her eyes looked hollow. "When did I become this person?" she whispered. Her phone buzzed in her clutch. She pulled it out, expecting another directive from Preston, but instead found a voicemail notification she had saved 3 years ago. Her father's voice. "Sweetheart, I will always be here when you are ready. I love you. That is never going to change." She had not spoken to William Webb since her wedding day, when he had begged her not to marry Preston Hargrove. She had chosen her husband over her father, certain that she knew better. She had been so wrong. Caroline was about to put her phone away when she noticed something on the counter. A phone that was not hers. Black case, silver initials etched into the corner. Preston's phone. He must have set it down when he came to check his hair. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. The screen was still unlocked. "Do not do this," she told herself. "Do not." She did it anyway. The text messages with Vanessa were the first thing she found. Months of flirtation, promises, plans. But it was the last message that made her blood run cold. Preston had written, "After the baby comes, we handle her. The prenup protects everything. She gets nothing," Vanessa had replied. "And if she fights Preston, she will not. She is too weak." Caroline read the words 3 times. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the phone. She had suspected his affair. She had even suspected he was planning to leave her. But seeing it in writing, seeing herself described as weak, something in her shifted. Not grief, Not even fear. Rage. She took screenshots and sent them to her own email. Then she deleted the evidence of what she had done and placed his phone exactly where she found it. When she walked back into the ballroom, her face was calm, but inside, something new was burning. Preston caught her eye from across the room and beckoned her over with a sharp gesture. The Hendersons wanted to meet his wife. Carolyn walked toward him, her posture perfect, her smile flawless. He thought she was weak. He thought she would fold quietly and disappear. He had no idea what she was capable of, but he was about to find out. As she approached, she noticed Vanessa watching her with a smirk, and Preston's hand settling possessively on her lower back. "We need to talk," Caroline said quietly, her voice steady. "Tonight, about us." Preston's eyes flashed with warning. "Not here, though." Caroline held his gaze. "Yes, here, for the first time in 4 years." She saw something new in his expression. Uncertainty. The confrontation happened faster than Caroline expected. She had planned to wait until after the party, to pull Preston aside when the guests were gone and demand answers in private. She had imagined a calm conversation, a careful presentation of evidence, perhaps even a negotiation. That was the lawyer in her, still believing that reason could prevail. But Preston did not give her that chance. He grabbed her wrist the moment the Hendersons walked away, his fingers digging into her skin with a pressure that would leave bruises by morning. His smile never wavered as he steered her toward the towering Christmas tree in the corner of the ballroom, away from the investors, away from the cameras. "What did you mean by that?" he hissed through his teeth. "We need to talk about us." "What exactly are you playing at?" Caroline tried to twist free, but his grip only tightened. "You are hurting me. I asked you a question." Around them, the party continued its glittering performance. Champagne flowed like water. Violins played holiday classics. 300 people in designer clothes laughed and mingled, completely oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the 12-foot tree. "I saw your texts," Caroline said quietly, keeping her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "With Vanessa, I know what you are planning." Preston's face went pale, then flushed deep red. His eyes, which had always reminded her of ice, now burned with something far more dangerous. "You went through my phone, you left it unlocked in the bathroom." She held his gaze, refusing to look away. "After the baby comes, we handle her. That is what you wrote to your mistress. So please, tell me what that means." From across the room, Vanessa was watching. Her crimson dress caught the light as she raised her champagne glass in a mocking salute. Her lips curved in a smile that made Caroline's stomach turn. Preston saw the direction of Caroline's gaze, and something in him snapped. The mask he wore so carefully in public, the charming businessman, the devoted husband, cracked and fell away. "You ungrateful," he started, his voice rising beyond a whisper. "Lower your voice," Caroline said. "People are watching. Let them watch." What happened next would replay in Caroline's nightmares for years to come. Every detail burned into her memory with terrible clarity. Preston's foot came up in a swift, brutal arc. There was no hesitation, no warning, just cold, deliberate violence. His Italian leather shoe connected with her hip, hard enough to lift her off her feet, and the force sent her stumbling backward into the Christmas tree. The impact was catastrophic. Glass ornaments shattered against the marble floor, exploding into fragments of red and gold that scattered like drops of blood. The tree swayed dangerously, its lights flickering, before crashing down in an avalanche of pine needles and broken decorations. Caroline fell with it, her arms wrapping instinctively around her belly as her body hit the cold stone floor. The music stopped mid-note. For one terrible, eternal moment, the entire ballroom fell silent. 300 faces turned toward the corner where Caroline lay among the wreckage, gasping for breath, surrounded by shards of glass and the ruins of holiday cheer. Then the phones came out, dozens of them, rising like a forest of judgment, their cameras capturing everything. The pregnant woman on the floor, the husband standing over her with clenched fists, the Christmas tree destroyed around them like a metaphor no one needed explained. Caroline tried to sit up, pain slicing through her side like a knife. The baby. She pressed her hands against her stomach, feeling desperately for movement, her heart stopping as she waited. "Please, please be okay." A small flutter beneath her palms. A kick. Weak but unmistakable. Relief crashed over her in a wave so powerful it nearly pulled her under. "She is fine," Preston announced loudly, addressing the crowd with his politician's smile firmly back in place. His voice carried across the silent ballroom. My wife slipped. You all saw the tree. She lost her balance. She is prone to episodes. No one moved. No one spoke. But no one lowered their phones either. And then the doors burst open. A gust of December air swept through the ballroom, carrying snowflakes that sparkled like diamonds under the crystal chandeliers. The cold cut through the stale warmth of the party, sharp and clean. From that white blur of winter walked a man in a Santa Claus suit, red velvet coat dusted with frost, black boots heavy on the marble floor, white beard catching the light. He tore off the fake beard and threw it aside, revealing a face Carolyn had not seen in 3 years but would recognize anywhere. William Webb, her father, the man she had pushed away, the man she had chosen Preston over, the man who had warned her this would happen. He crossed the room in 4 long strides, ignoring the gasps and whispers, his eyes locked on his daughter lying broken on the floor. Sweetheart. He dropped to his knees beside her, his voice cracking. His hands hovered over her as if afraid to touch her, afraid to hurt her more. Are you hurt? Is the baby okay, Dad? The word came out as a sob. Tears streamed down Caroline's face, cutting tracks through her makeup. I am so sorry. I should have listened to you. Do not apologize. Never apologize. William's hands were trembling as he helped her sit up, brushing broken glass from her hair with infinite gentleness. I should have tried harder. I should have been here. Behind them, Preston was retreating toward the crowd of investors, trying to disappear into the sea of shocked faces. But William was not finished. He rose slowly, his Santa coat brushing against the broken ornaments, and turned to face his son-in-law. The transformation was immediate. This was no longer a worried father. This was the CEO who had built an empire from nothing. I saw what you did, William said, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom like a judge delivering a verdict. So did everyone else, and so did every camera in this room. Preston's smile faltered. It was an accident. She fell. She is emotional. The pregnancy has made her unstable. William stepped closer, his voice dropping to something cold and terrifying. You just ended your life as you know it, he said quietly, and I am going to make sure of it. The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and fluorescent lights. Caroline lay on the stretcher, her father's hand gripping hers so tightly it almost hurt. Paramedics moved around them with practiced efficiency, checking vitals, asking questions, their voices calm but urgent. How far along are you? Any contractions, any bleeding? Do you have a regular physician? She answered on autopilot, her mind stuck on an endless loop. The kick, the fall, the sound of glass shattering, the look in Preston's eyes, not remorse, not fear, just calculation. At the hospital, they rushed her through automatic doors into a world of white walls and antiseptic smell. Her father jogged alongside the gurney until a nurse stopped him with a firm hand. Sir, you need to wait here. We will update you as soon as we can. William looked like he might argue, might fight, might burn the whole hospital down. But then his eyes met Caroline's, and she saw something she had never seen before. Her father, the man who had stared down corporate sharks and hostile takeovers without flinching, was terrified. It is okay, she told him as they wheeled her away. I am going to be okay. She was not sure she believed it. The examination felt endless. Monitors beeped. Doctors consulted in hushed voices. A technician ran an ultrasound wand across her belly while Caroline held her breath, searching the grainy screen for signs of life. Then she heard it. A heartbeat. Fast and strong. The baby's vitals are stable. The attending physician finally announced, her face cautious but kind. We want to keep you overnight for observation. But so far, everything looks good. You are very fortunate. Fortunate. Carolyn almost laughed at the word. She had been kicked to the ground by her husband in front of 300 people. Fortunate seemed like a stretch. Thank you, she said instead. Thank you for taking care of us. When her father finally entered the room, he looked older than she remembered. The Santa suit was gone, replaced by a borrowed hospital scrub top over his dress pants. His gray hair was disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion and guilt. I should have tried harder, he said quietly, sinking into the chair beside her bed. After you stopped returning my calls, After you told me you never wanted to see me again, I should have shown up anyway. I should have broken down the door. Caroline shook her head against the thin hospital pillow. I pushed you away. I chose him over you. I said terrible things. You were in love. William took her hand, his grip warm and steady. That is what love does. It blinds us to what we do not want to see. I do not blame you. I never blamed you. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The beeping of the fetal monitor filled the silence, steady and reassuring. A constant reminder that, despite everything, life persisted. How did you know to come tonight? Carolyn finally asked. How did you know to be there? William's jaw tightened. I have had someone watching you for 2 years. Not following you, not spying, just making sure you were safe. When they told me about the party, when they told me Preston had been drinking and arguing with investors all day, I had a bad feeling. So you dressed as Santa? He almost smiled. I was supposed to make a grand entrance at midnight, surprise the guests, hand out gifts, spread some holiday cheer. Your husband hired me, actually, through a charity I support. He never knew who was behind the beard. Carolyn felt tears prick her eyes again. You were there the whole time in the back, waiting, watching. And when I saw what he did to you, William's voice broke. When I saw you fall, I thought I had lost you. She squeezed his hand. You did not lose me. I am right here. They sat in silence for another moment, father and daughter, reconnecting across years of distance and pain. Then Caroline reached for her purse, still miraculously with her after the chaos of the evening. I need to show you something, she said. She opened her email and found the screenshot she had sent herself hours earlier. Preston's text with Vanessa, the plans to handle her after the baby was born, the cold calculation of a man planning to discard his wife. William read them in silence, his expression shifting from shock to disgust to something harder, something dangerous. He was going to take everything from you, he said finally. The baby, the money, your reputation. He had it all planned. Carolyn nodded. But here is the thing, Dad. I spent 3 years watching him, listening, paying attention when he thought I was just a pretty decoration on his arm. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook, battered and worn from years of secret use. I was a corporate lawyer before I gave up my career for him. I know how to spot fraud, and I noticed things that did not add up. What kind of things? Offshore accounts that appear and disappear, fake charities that never actually donate anything, construction permits that do not match the properties they are filed for. She opened the notebook, showing him pages of dates, names, numbers. I started writing it down a year ago, when I first suspected something was wrong. I just did not know what to do with it. William stared at the notebook like it contained a bomb. This is evidence? Maybe. If someone can verify it, if someone with resources can follow the trail. He looked up at her, something new in his eyes. Pride, maybe, or recognition. You are not the girl I said goodbye to at that wedding, he said quietly. No, Caroline agreed. I am not. William stood and began pacing the small room, but this time with purpose rather than panic. His mind was clearly working, calculating, planning. He will try to spin this, he said. The video is everywhere by now, but he has money and lawyers and connections. He will claim you slipped. He will claim you are mentally unstable. He will make you the villain in your own story. I know. Then we need to move fast. I have contacts, people who owe me favors. If what you have in that notebook checks out, we can bury him. Carolyn shook her head. Not yet. Her father stopped pacing. What do you mean? Not yet. If we attack now, he will play victim. He will claim we are targeting him because of a family dispute, that this is revenge, not justice. She sat up straighter, wincing at the pain in her hip. We need more. We need irrefutable proof, and we need him to make mistakes. William studied her for a long moment. You have a plan. I have the beginning of one. Her phone buzzed on the bedside table, a text from an unknown number. Carolyn read it, her heart skipping. We need to talk. He is going to destroy you unless I help. Meet me tomorrow. Vanessa? She showed the message to her father. That is his mistress. She explained. The one he has been planning to replace me with. William's eyes narrowed with suspicion, and she wants to help you, maybe. Or maybe it is a trap. Caroline looked at the message again, weighing the risks. Either way, I need to find out. This is dangerous. Everything about my life is dangerous right now. Dad, she met his gaze, her voice steady. At least this way, I am the one making the moves. The video spread like wildfire. Within 48 hours, the footage from the Christmas party had been viewed over 20 million times. News anchors played it on loop, freezing on the moment Preston's foot connected with Caroline's hip, the moment her body crumpled backward into the tree, the moment 300 guests stood frozen in horror. The hashtag Justice for Caroline trended worldwide. Caroline scrolled through the comments from her hospital bed, tears streaming down her face. Not tears of sadness, but something closer to relief. For years, she had convinced herself that no one would believe her, that Preston was too powerful, too charming, too careful. Now the whole world had seen the truth with their own eyes. Women shared their own stories in the comments. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. He did this to me too, one woman wrote. But no one was recording. Another said, I stayed for 15 years because I thought I was alone. Thank you for showing me I am not. A mother posted, my daughter is watching this. I am finally going to tell her why I left her father. For the first time since her wedding, Carolyn felt like she was not alone. The support was overwhelming. Donations poured into domestic violence organizations. Politicians called for stronger protections. Celebrities spoke out. The tide of public opinion had turned completely in her favor. The meeting with Vanessa happened 3 days after the party, in a small coffee shop in a neighborhood far from downtown where neither of them would be recognized. Caroline arrived first, choosing a table in the back corner where she could watch the door. Her father had wanted to come, but she had refused. This is something I need to do myself. She had told him, I need to look her in the eye. Vanessa arrived looking nothing like the confident woman in the crimson dress. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen. Her hands trembled as she slid into the seat across from Caroline. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. I know you hate me, Vanessa finally said. You have every right to hate me. I helped him hurt you. Caroline studied her former rival. Why are you here? Vanessa reached into her purse and pulled out a USB drive, sliding it across the table. 5 years of records, she said quietly. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Fake invoices from companies that do not exist. Bribery payments to city officials who approved his construction permits. I kept copies of everything because I knew he would turn on me eventually. Caroline picked up the drive, turning it over in her fingers. Why now? Why help me after everything you did? Vanessa's hand moved to her own stomach, pressing against the fabric of her sweater, a gesture Caroline recognized instantly. You are pregnant, Caroline said. Vanessa nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. 8 weeks. He does not know yet. I was going to tell him the night of the party, but then I saw what he did to you, and I realized something that changed everything. What? That I am just as disposable as you are. Vanessa wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. He promised we would be together. He promised he would leave you and marry me. But watching him kick you, watching him stand over you without any remorse, I finally understood. He does not love anyone. He only loves control. Caroline should have felt satisfaction. Instead, she felt something closer to pity. What do you want from me? She asked. I want you to destroy him. Vanessa's voice hardened. I want you to take everything he has, and I want to help you do it. The next week brought victory after victory. A judge granted Caroline a temporary restraining order, forcing Preston out of their home. His investors began distancing themselves publicly, worried about the association with his name. The board of Hargrove Global scheduled an emergency meeting to discuss his leadership in the company's future. Williams' forensic accountants worked around the clock to verify Vanessa's files. After 3 days of analysis, they delivered their verdict. It is real. William told Caroline during a late-night strategy session in her hospital room. All of it. The fraud is massive. We are talking about over $80 million hidden across dozens of shell companies and fake charities. Caroline allowed herself to feel hope for the first time in years. Her mother, Dorothy, arrived that same week, flying in from their family home upstate. She brought homemade chicken soup in mason jars and the quiet comfort that only mothers can provide. Your father never stopped worrying about you, Dorothy said, smoothing Caroline's hair the way she had when Caroline was a child waking from nightmares. He checked on you every week, Amon. He hired someone to make sure you were safe. He just did not know how to reach you without pushing you further away. I was so stubborn, Caroline whispered. You were in love with the wrong man. Her mother's eyes were gentle but knowing. That does not make you stupid. Sweetheart, it makes you human. We have all been blinded by love at some point. Tell me what time you are watching and where you are tuning in from. I want to hear your thoughts on this moment. Do you think Caroline should trust that everything is finally going her way? Or do you sense that something is about to go terribly wrong? Even her best friend Stephanie Morris came to visit, bringing an enormous bouquet of flowers and tearful apologies. I had no idea he was hurting you, Stephanie said, wrapping Caroline in a careful hug. You always seemed so happy whenever we talked. You never said anything. I was very good at pretending, Caroline admitted. I convinced myself that if I was just better, just quieter, just more perfect, he would stop. That is not how it works, Stephanie said softly. You know that now, right? Caroline nodded. I know. That night, after everyone had gone home, Caroline sat in the nursery she had been preparing for months. The walls were painted a soft sage green. A white crib stood in the corner, already assembled and waiting. Her baby kicked gently beneath her hand. We are safe now, she whispered to her son. We are going to be okay. I promise, Bordiato. She did not see Stephanie in the guest room down the hall, sitting on the edge of the bed with her phone pressed to her ear. She has everything, Stephanie said quietly. Vanessa gave her all the files. The FBI is already interested. The voice on the other end was cold and familiar. Keep watching. Report everything she does. I will handle the rest. Stephanie ended the call and deleted it from her history. Then she walked back to the living room with a warm smile on her face. The police arrived at 6 in the morning. Carolyn was still in her bathrobe, standing in the kitchen making tea, when the pounding on the front door jolted her so badly she dropped the mug. It shattered on the tile floor, but she barely noticed. Through the frosted glass, she could see uniforms, multiple uniforms. Her hands were shaking as she opened the door. 2 police officers and a detective stood on her doorstep, their faces carefully blank. Behind them, a patrol car sat in the driveway with its lights flashing. Mrs. Hargrove, the detective said, flashing his badge, we have a warrant to search these premises. You need to come with us for questioning. Questioning about what Caroline's voice came out higher than she intended. My husband assaulted me. He kicked me in front of 300 people. Why are you at my door? The detective's expression did not change. Your husband has filed a complaint alleging theft of proprietary business information. We need to ask you some questions about how you obtained certain documents. Caroline felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. That is insane, so he is the criminal. He is the one who should be arrested. Ma'am, please do not make this difficult. The detective stepped past her into the house. We have authorization to seize any electronic devices, storage media, and paper documents related to Hargrove Global Operations. The next 2 hours were a nightmare. They took the USB drive Vanessa had given her. They seized her laptop, her phone, her father's files. They photographed her notebooks, the ones she had kept hidden for years, documenting every suspicious transaction she had observed. They took everything. By noon, Caroline was sitting in an interrogation room at the police station, her lawyer Rebecca Thornton beside her, while the detective asked the same questions over and over. How did you obtain these files? Who gave them to you? Did you threaten or coerce anyone to provide this information? I already told you. Carolyn repeated for what felt like the 100th time. Vanessa Cole came to me voluntarily. She wanted to help expose her employer's crimes. The detective leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. That is not what she says. Carolyn's stomach dropped. What do you mean? Rebecca held up a hand before Caroline could say anything else. My client is not answering any more questions. I need to see whatever statement you have from this Vanessa Cole. The detective slid a document across the table, an affidavit, signed and notarized, with Vanessa's name at the bottom. Caroline read it with mounting horror. According to the document, Caroline had threatened to expose Vanessa's affair unless she helped frame Preston. Caroline had coerced her into stealing confidential documents. Caroline had manipulated federal investigators with fabricated evidence. Every word was a lie. And every word was devastating. She flipped. Rebecca said grimly after they finally released Caroline that evening. Preston bought her off. She is living in one of his properties now, with round-the-clock security. She is not talking to anyone, but the files are real, Caroline insisted. The fraud is real. How can they ignore that? They are not ignoring it. But if the court throws out how you obtained the evidence, it does not matter how real it is. And right now, that is exactly what Preston's lawyers are arguing. They are claiming fruit of the poisonous tree. Carolyn sank onto a bench outside the police station, her head in her hands. It was all for nothing, but the nightmare was just beginning. Within hours, Preston's counterattack was in full swing. His PR team flooded the media with a new narrative, one carefully crafted to destroy everything Caroline had built. Desperate wife fabricates abuse claims to steal from husband during bitter divorce. The headline screamed. Medical experts appeared on cable news programs, analyzing the video frame by frame, claiming that the kick could not have caused serious injury. They pointed to the angle, the force, the way Caroline had fallen. It looks worse than it was, one doctor said confidently. This was clearly exaggerated for the cameras. Old colleagues were quoted in articles, painting Caroline as emotionally volatile, unstable, prone to dramatic outbursts. She always had a temper, a former coworker said anonymously. I am not surprised this marriage ended badly. Her therapy records somehow found their way onto gossip websites, sessions where she had discussed her anxiety, her fears, her occasional dark thoughts during the worst days of her marriage, all of it twisted to make her look dangerous. And worst of all, there was Stephanie. William's security team had been running background checks on everyone in Caroline's life. What they found made Caroline's blood run cold. Your friend Stephanie, her father said, his voice heavy with grief. She has received over $50,000 from Preston's accounts in the past 18 months. Monthly payments, always in cash, deposited into a separate account under her maiden name. Caroline stared at him. That is not possible. I am sorry, sweetheart. He pulled up the bank records on his laptop. She has been reporting to him since before your wedding. Every secret, every fear, every plan you shared with her. He knew about all of it. Carolyn picked up her phone and called Stephanie's number. She answered on the second ring. Hey, honey, how are you feeling? How long? Caroline's voice was ice. A pause. What do you mean? How long have you been working for him? The silence stretched for an eternity. When Stephanie finally spoke, her voice was different, colder, harder. Since before your wedding, he wanted insurance in case you ever became a problem. Everything I told you, you told him every word. Stephanie laughed softly. You were never as smart as you thought. Carolyn, you were just easy to manipulate. Carolyn ended the call and threw her phone across the room. Her husband, his mistress, her best friend, everyone she had trusted had been working against her. The emergency custody hearing was scheduled for the following week. Preston's lawyers argued that Caroline was mentally unstable, that her evidence was fabricated, that she posed a danger to her unborn child. The judge, an older man with cold eyes and a reputation for favoring wealthy defendants, reviewed the competing claims. Given the ongoing investigation, he said finally, his voice flat and dispassionate, and the serious allegations on both sides, I am granting temporary custody to Mr. Hargrove, effective upon the birth of the child. No, the word tore from Caroline's throat like a scream. No, you cannot do this. Her father grabbed her arm, holding her upright as her legs buckled beneath her. We will appeal, William said urgently. We will fight this. This is not over. But the words sounded hollow against the ringing in her ears. Preston stood across the courtroom, straightening his tie, smiling the smile of a man who had never lost anything in his life. That night, alone in her childhood bedroom, Carolyn stared at the ceiling and wondered if she had anything left to fight with. Then she remembered something her law professor had said years ago, a phrase that had seemed abstract at the time but now felt like a lifeline. The mistake most victims make is fighting the man. Smart victims fight the system that protects him. She reached for her old law school files, buried in a box in the closet since she had abandoned her career. If Preston wanted a war, she would give him one. But this time, she would fight smarter. The first catastrophe came without warning, 34 weeks into her pregnancy. The stress of the legal battle triggered early labor. Caroline woke at 3 in the morning to searing pain that radiated through her entire body. She called for an ambulance, clutching her phone with trembling hands as she gave the dispatcher her address. The ride to the hospital was a blur of sirens and fear. "We need to perform an emergency cesarean," the surgeon explained, his voice calm but urgent. "Your blood pressure is dangerously high and the baby is in distress. We need to act now." Caroline nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Just save him. Please save him." Her son was born at 4:17 in the morning, weighing just under 5 pounds. "He is alive," the nurse told her as they wheeled him away. "But he needs help breathing. We are taking him to the NICU." Carolyn spent the next 3 days in a fog of painkillers and terror. She could only see her baby through the glass of the intensive care unit, watching his tiny chest rise and fall with the help of machines. "His lungs are not fully developed," the neonatologist explained during rounds. "We are looking at 2 to 3 weeks before he can go home, maybe longer." Caroline pressed her palm against the glass barrier, aching to hold him. "I am so sorry," she whispered. "I should have protected you better. I should have left him sooner. This is all my fault." Her father found her there at midnight, still standing at the window. "This is not your fault," William said firmly. "None of this is your fault. Then why does it feel like I am being punished?" He had no answer for that. The second catastrophe arrived 2 days later. Caroline was finally strong enough to sit in a wheelchair beside her son's incubator when the nurse appeared with a worried expression. "Mrs. Hargrove, there are some people here to see you. They have legal documents." Caroline's blood ran cold. Preston appeared in the doorway of the NICU, flanked by his lawyer and a hospital administrator. He was wearing a tailored suit and a smile that made her skin crawl. "The court order is clear," the lawyer said smoothly, holding up a folder of papers. "When the child is released from medical care, custody transfers to Mr. Hargrove." "No." Carolyn gripped the arms of her wheelchair. "No, you cannot do this." Preston stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper only she could hear. "I told you what would happen if you fought me. Did you think I was bluffing? Something inside?" Caroline snapped. She launched herself out of the wheelchair, her stitches screaming in protest, her hands reaching for Preston's throat. Security guards grabbed her before she could make contact. They held her back while Preston watched with that infuriating, satisfied smile. "You see," he said loudly, addressing the guards and nurses, "unstable, violent, just like I told the judge." They escorted him out while Caroline collapsed against the glass of the incubator, sobbing. Her father arrived 20 minutes later, white-faced with fury. "We will fight this," he said. "We will appeal." But Caroline could barely hear him. All she could see was her son, fragile and small, about to be taken by the man who had tried to kill them both. The third catastrophe hit her father. Preston's allies launched a coordinated attack on web construction. Major contracts were suddenly under review. Suppliers demanded early payment on outstanding invoices. 3 board members resigned without explanation. The company's stock price dropped 40% in a single week. "He is trying to bankrupt me," William said during a late-night phone call. His voice was exhausted in a way Caroline had never heard before. "If I cannot fund your legal defense, if I cannot pay the attorneys, you have nothing left. Dad, I never meant for this to happen. You did not do this." "He did." William paused, and Caroline could hear the weight of decades in his silence. "I would burn every dollar I have before I let him take my grandson. But I am running out of dollars to burn." Caroline sat in the hospital chapel that night, alone in the darkness except for a single candle flickering on the altar. Have you ever felt like everything was falling apart at once, like no matter what you did, you could not stop the walls from closing in? Drop a comment and tell me about a time when you thought you had lost everything, because that is exactly where Caroline was. Rock bottom, no way out. Except there was a way out, she just had not found it yet. She spent the next 3 nights researching in the hospital waiting room, her laptop balanced on her knees while her son fought for his life 20 feet away. Vanessa's files had been seized. But Caroline remembered something from her days as a corporate lawyer. The obvious evidence was rarely the real story. Preston had let Vanessa take those files because they were damaging but survivable. The real fraud would be buried deeper, with someone Preston trusted completely. She started making calls to old contacts from her law school days, former classmates who now worked in federal agencies. Prosecutors who remembered her as the promising young attorney she had been before she threw it all away. One name kept coming up: Gregory Hartwell, Preston's chief financial officer. The man who signed off on every transaction, who knew where every dollar went. If anyone knew where the real evidence was hidden, it would be him. And Caroline remembered something else. Gregory had a weakness: an affair with her former paralegal, a woman named Jessica, who still owed Caroline a favor. She picked up her phone and started typing a message. The game was about to change. And this time, Caroline would be the one setting the trap. The meeting with the federal prosecutor happened in a secure conference room on the 14th floor of the federal building downtown. Caroline arrived with her lawyer, Rebecca, carrying a binder full of notes she had compiled over sleepless nights in the hospital waiting room. Her hands were steady as she walked through the metal detectors. But inside, her heart was pounding. This was her last chance. If this did not work, she would lose everything. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Foster, sat across the conference table with two assistants flanking on her. She studied Caroline with the skeptical gaze of someone who had heard too many stories from too many desperate people. "Mrs. Hargrove," Margaret began, folding her hands on the table, "I want to be direct with you. Your credibility is compromised. Your husband has accused you of theft. His mistress has signed an affidavit testifying against you. Half the media thinks you are a vindictive wife trying to steal from a successful businessman. So tell me, why should we trust anything you say?" Caroline had expected this. She had prepared for it. "Because I am not giving you evidence I stole," she said calmly, pushing the binder across the table. "I am giving you a roadmap to evidence you can obtain legally." Margaret raised an eyebrow but did not touch the binder. "Explain." Caroline took a breath, organizing her thoughts the way she used to before presenting cases in court. It felt strange to use those skills again after so many years, but also right, like putting on a coat that still fit perfectly. Vanessa Cole's files were a decoy. She began. "Preston let her take those documents because they are damaging but survivable. A few million in offshore accounts, some questionable invoices, enough to create a scandal, but not enough to bring down the empire." "Go on." "The real fraud is in the municipal construction contracts." Carolyn leaned forward, her voice gaining confidence. "Over the past 5 years, Hargrove Global has been awarded over $200 million in city contracts. Permits that should have taken months were approved in weeks. Inspections that should have failed passed without question. Someone was being paid, and the money trail is hidden in places Vanessa never had access to." Margaret's expression shifted slightly, less skeptical, more interested. "And where exactly is this evidence hidden?" "With Gregory Hartwell, Preston's chief financial officer. He signs off on every transaction. He knows where every dollar goes. If anyone has access to the real books, it is him." One of Margaret's assistants leaned over and whispered something. Margaret nodded slowly. "Gregory Hartwell has been on our radar for some time," she admitted, "but we have never been able to get close to him. He is extremely careful. He has a weakness." Caroline pulled out a photograph from her binder. "A woman named Jessica Brennan. She used to work for me as a paralegal before I left my career. For the past 2 years, she has been having an affair with Gregory. She trusts me." Margaret studied the photograph, then looked back at Caroline with new respect. "You want to help us set up a sting operation. I want to save my son." Caroline held her gaze without flinching. "Everything else is secondary." The silence in the room stretched. Margaret exchanged glances with her team. Caroline could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. "Finally, my dear Broah," Margaret spoke. "If you can get us access to Hartwell's records, we will take another look at this case. But I need you to understand something, Mrs. Hargrove. If this goes wrong, if you are caught, we cannot protect you. You will be on your own." Caroline nodded. "I understand. Then let us talk about how we are going to do this." The operation took 2 weeks to plan. Carolyn contacted Jessica under the guise of reaching out to old friends. They met for coffee, then lunch, then drinks. Each time, Carolyn listened carefully as Jessica complained about Gregory, about his paranoia, about the secrets he kept. "He never lets me see anything on his computer," Jessica said one evening, swirling wine in her glass. "He has this encrypted drive he carries everywhere, backs up everything to it. I asked him once what was on it, and he nearly bit my head off." Caroline kept her voice casual. Do you know the password? Jessica laughed bitterly. He uses his mother's birthday for everything. The man is not as smart as he thinks he is. That night, Caroline relayed the information to Margaret Foster's team. They developed a plan. Jessica would create an opportunity, a distraction while Gregory was in his hotel room. Caroline would be nearby with a federal technician. They would have a narrow window to copy the drive without Gregory knowing. One chance. No room for error. The night of the operation, Carolyn waited in a hotel room 2 floors below Gregory's suite. Her hands were shaking despite her best efforts to stay calm. A federal technician sat beside her, laptop open, equipment ready. Her father had wanted to come, but she had refused. This is my fight, she had told him earlier that day. You have done enough. You have sacrificed enough. Let me finish this. William had looked at her for a long moment, his eyes glistening. You sound like your mother, he had said quietly. She never let anyone fight her battles either. Now, us alone in the hotel room, Caroline thought about her mother, about the strength Dorothy had always carried so quietly, about the way she had held the family together through every crisis. I hope I make you proud, Caroline whispered into the silence. At 11:47 p.m., her phone buzzed. A text from Jessica. He is in the shower. Laptop is on the desk. You have 10 minutes. Caroline and the technician moved quickly. Down the hallway, into the service elevator. Up 2 floors. The technician used a cloned keycard to open the door to Gregory's suite. The room was dark except for the glow of the laptop screen. They could hear water running in the bathroom. Steam curled under the door. 4 minutes to copy the drive. 3 minutes to verify the files. 2 minutes to get out. Caroline kept watch while the technician worked. Her heart pounding so loudly she was certain Gregory would hear it through the walls. Every second felt like an hour. Copy complete. The technician whispered. They slipped out of the room and back into the service elevator. The doors closed just as they heard the bathroom door open behind them. 30 seconds to spare. Back in the safe house. The technician opened the copied files on a secure computer. His face went pale as he scrolled through the contents. This is everything, he said quietly. Forged permits, bribery records, money laundering through fake charities, payments to city officials going back 7 years. This is enough to bring down the entire company. Carolyn stared at the screen, at the evidence she had risked everything to obtain. Names, dates, amounts, proof of every crime Preston had committed. She closed her eyes and let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for months. For the first time since that terrible Christmas night, she allowed herself to believe she might actually win. She picked up her phone and called her father. We got it, she said when he answered. We got everything. On the other end of the line, she heard William Webb, the man who had built towers and empires, break down and cry. The FBI raid happened at dawn. Carolyn watched from a parked car across the street as federal agents had swarmed the headquarters of Hargrove Global. Black SUVs lined the entire block. Agents in Navy jackets moved with military precision, carrying out boxes of documents, while stunned employees gathered on the sidewalk in their business attire, clutching coffee cups in confusion. Her father sat beside her, his hand covering hers. You did this, William said quietly. You brought him down. Carolyn shook her head. We did this. All of us. Simultaneous raids hit Gregory Hartwell's home across town, the offshore accountant's office in the financial district, and 3 separate properties linked to Preston's network of shell companies. Margaret Foster had coordinated the entire operation. 37 federal agents, 14 search warrants. One very bad morning for Preston Hargrove, and at 6:23 in the morning, agents arrived at Preston's penthouse with an arrest warrant. Carolyn had asked to be there. Margaret had reluctantly agreed, with the condition that she stay back and let the agents do their work. She stood in the hallway of the luxury building as they led Preston out in handcuffs. His hair was disheveled, his silk pajamas wrinkled, his face contorted with a disbelief that bordered on madness. Do you know who I am? He shouted at the agents flanking him. This is harassment. This is a political vendetta. I will have all of your badges. The agents said nothing. They had heard it all before. Then Preston saw Caroline. For a moment, neither of them spoke. 4 years of marriage, 4 years of control and fear and violence, all of it compressed into a single look between two people who had once promised to love each other. You did this, Preston hissed. You conniving, manipulative little Caroline stepped closer, her voice steady and calm. You told Vanessa I was too weak to fight. She met his eyes without flinching. You were wrong. They led him away, still shouting threats and promises of revenge. Caroline watched until he disappeared into the elevator, and then she let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for years. Vanessa was arrested the same morning on accessory charges. Her immunity deal had required her to stay loyal to Preston and testify against Caroline. Instead of protection, she got prosecution. Gregory Hartwell flipped within 48 hours, offering to testify against Preston in exchange for a reduced sentence. The evidence from his copied drive corroborated everything Caroline had suspected and revealed even more. The press conference happened 3 days later. Caroline stood on the steps of the federal courthouse, cameras flashing like lightning, reporters shouting questions over each other. She had written and rewritten her statement a dozen times. In the end, she threw away the paper and spoke from the heart. I was told to stay quiet, she said, her voice carrying across the crowd and the microphones and the cameras broadcasting live to millions. I was called crazy. I was told I was imagining things. I was told that I was the problem, that I was unstable, that I was dangerous. She paused, gathering herself. I lost temporary custody of my son because a judge believed a man with expensive lawyers over a woman with bruises. I watched my father's company nearly destroyed because he dared to stand by me. I spent months wondering if I would ever hold my child again. The crowd was silent now. Even the reporters had stopped shouting. But I want every woman watching to know something. Carolyn looked directly into the cameras, speaking to every person who had ever felt trapped, ever felt hopeless, ever felt alone. They can take your dignity. They can take your reputation. They can take your family, but they cannot take your fight unless you let them. She straightened her shoulders. And I refused to let them. The clip went viral within hours. But this time, the tone of the comments was different. This was not sympathy for a victim. This was admiration for a warrior. That night, her father called with the news she had been waiting for. The custody order has been vacated, William said, his voice cracking with emotion. Preston's assets are frozen. He cannot fund a legal defense, let alone claim he can support a child. The judge is scheduling a new hearing. Carolyn sank onto her bed, tears streaming down her face. When can I see him tomorrow morning? They are releasing him from the NICU at 9. You can be there when he takes his first breath outside those walls. For a long moment, Caroline could not speak. She had imagined this moment so many times, dreamed of it during the endless nights in the hospital chapel, prayed for it when she had nothing left but prayer. Thank you, she finally whispered. Thank you. She did not sleep that night. She lay awake in the darkness, counting the hours until morning, until she could finally hold her son. At 8:45 the next morning, Carolyn walked into the NICU for the last time. The nurses were waiting for her, smiling through their own tears. They had watched her fight. They had seen her at her lowest, and now they were witnessing her victory. A nurse placed her son in her arms. He was so small, so perfect, so alive. Hi, baby, Carolyn whispered, tears falling onto his blanket. It is Mama. I am here. I am never letting go of you again. Behind her, William stood in the doorway, his hand pressed over his heart, and for the first time since that terrible Christmas night, everything felt right. The criminal trial lasted 3 weeks. Caroline attended every day, sitting in the gallery with her father, watching as prosecutors methodically dismantled the empire Preston had built on lies and stolen money. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the back rows, their notebooks open, their pens scratching across pages. Former employees of Hargrove Global sat with haunted expressions, finally seeing the truth about the man they had worked for. And scattered throughout the gallery were women, dozens of them, who had followed Carolyn's story and come to witness the ending. Gregory Hartwell was the first major witness. He testified for 2 full days about the forged permits, the bribery payments to city officials, the shell companies that existed only on paper. Forensic accountants followed, tracing $87 million through a maze of offshore accounts and fake charities. The numbers were staggering. The fraud was systematic, and all of it led back to Preston Hargrove. Former employees described a culture of intimidation and fear. secretaries who had been fired for asking questions, accountants who had been threatened into silence, a company built on secrets and suffering. And on the 8th day of the trial, the video from the Christmas party played one final time. The courtroom fell silent as the footage appeared on the large screen, the glittering ballroom, the towering Christmas tree, Carolyn in her blue dress, beautiful and pregnant and trying so hard to be invisible. And then the kick. Caroline forced herself to watch. She watched herself fall. She watched the ornaments shatter. She watched Preston stand over her with clenched fists and no remorse. Several jurors turned away. One woman in the front row was crying. Preston sat at the defense table with his face carefully blank, but Caroline could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched as the video played. He knew he was losing. Preston's defense team tried everything in their arsenal. They claimed the evidence was obtained illegally through entrapment. They argued that Caroline had manipulated federal agents into targeting her husband. They suggested the entire investigation was a vendetta by a bitter, unstable wife. None of it worked. On the final day of testimony, Caroline was called as a witness. She walked to the stand with steady steps, her heart pounding but her face calm. She had practiced this moment in her mind 1,000 times. She was ready. The prosecutor asked her to describe her marriage, the isolation, the control, the escalating violence that she had hidden from everyone, including herself. It started small, Caroline said, her voice clear enough to reach every corner of the silent courtroom. Comments about my clothes, criticism of my friends. He convinced me, piece by piece, that everyone else was the problem, and he was the only one who truly understood me. She paused, gathering the next words. By the time I realized what was happening, I had no career, no friends, no money of my own. I was completely dependent on him, and that was exactly what he wanted. The jury listened. The gallery listened. The whole world, it seemed, was listening. He did not just hit me that night, Caroline continued, looking directly at the 12 men and women who would decide Preston's fate. He spent 4 years making sure I had no friends, no career, no way out. The kick was just the first time he did it in public. Preston's lawyer rose for cross-examination, his voice dripping with condescension. Mrs. Hargrove, is it not true that you orchestrated this entire scheme to steal your husband's money during the divorce? Caroline met his gaze calmly. I orchestrated a scheme to protect my child from a violent man. Everything else was survival. And is it not true that you manipulated federal agents, seduced witnesses, and fabricated evidence to destroy your husband's reputation? No, Caroline said simply. Everything I did was legal. Everything I told them was true. The only fabrication in this courtroom is the version of events your client is trying to sell. The lawyer sputtered, but Caroline was not finished. Your client kicked me while I was 7 months pregnant, she said, her voice rising. He did it in front of 300 witnesses and dozens of cameras. He did it because he thought he was untouchable. He was wrong. If you are watching this and you have ever been told that you are crazy, that you are making things up, that no one will believe you, I want you to hear something. The truth matters, your voice matters, and sometimes justice takes longer than it should, but it does come. Keep fighting. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Wire fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, assault causing bodily harm. The sentence came 2 weeks later, 18 years in federal prison. No possibility of parole for the first 12. Carolyn watched as they led Preston away in handcuffs. He did not look at her. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge her existence at all. He simply walked through the doors and disappeared from her life forever. After the courtroom emptied, Carolyn sat alone in the gallery for a long time. The silence felt sacred somehow, like the aftermath of a storm. Her father found her there. How do you feel? He asked quietly. Sitting down beside her, she thought about the question, about everything she had lost, about everything she had survived. Free. She said finally, I feel free. 2 years had passed since the Christmas party that changed everything. Carolyn stood in the nursery of her modest apartment, watching her son sleep. He was 2 years old now, with her dark hair and his father's stubborn chin, though she tried not to think about that part. She had named him William, after her father. Everyone called him Will. The apartment was small compared to the mansion she had once lived in, but it was hers. She had bought it with money from her law practice, not from her family, not from the settlement. Her phone buzzed. A text from Rebecca about a new client, another woman trying to escape a dangerous marriage, another life they might be able to save. Caroline typed a quick reply, then set the phone aside. The past 2 years had not been easy. She still had nightmares. She still flinched sometimes when men raised their voice. She still struggled to trust people, even those who had proven themselves loyal. The scars did not disappear just because the monster was in prison, but she was learning to live with them. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find her father standing in the hallway, holding a wrapped gift. "A little early for his birthday," Carolyn said, smiling. William shrugged. Grandfathers are allowed to spoil their grandchildren. They sat together in the living room while Will napped, sharing coffee and comfortable silence. "Your mother would be proud of you," William said quietly. Caroline's eyes stung. Dorothy had passed away 8 months ago, just long enough after the trial to see her daughter win. The cancer had been quick, almost merciful. "She held on for you," William continued. "She told me that herself, right at the end. She said she needed to see you safe before she could let go." Caroline wiped her eyes. "I wish I had more time with her." "You had the time that mattered." They talked about the practice, about Will, about the future. William's company had never fully recovered from Preston's attacks, and he had stepped down as CEO the previous year. But he seemed lighter now, less burdened. "I spent my whole life building things," he said. "Towers, companies, empires, but none of it matters as much as this." He gestured at the small apartment, at the sleeping child in the next room, at Caroline herself. "This is what matters. Family, love, people who fight for each other." Caroline reached across the table and took his hand. "Thank you," she said, "for coming back for me, for never giving up. I would do it all again." That evening, after William left and Will woke from his nap, Caroline took her son for a walk in the park near their apartment. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Will toddled along beside her, pointing at birds and tongues and everything else that caught his attention. She thought about the woman she had been 4 years ago, the corporate lawyer who had given up her career for a man she thought she loved, the wife who had learned to make herself small, the victim who had lain broken on a ballroom floor while the world watched. That woman felt like a stranger now. "Mama," Will said, tugging at her hand. "Look." He was pointing at a woman across the park, sitting alone on a bench, her shoulders hunched, her eyes red. Caroline recognized the posture. She had worn it herself for years. "Wait here for 1 second," she told Will, guiding him to a nearby bench where she could still see him. Then she walked over to the woman. "Are you okay?" Caroline asked gently. The woman looked up, startled. Tears streamed down her face. "I am sorry," the woman said. "I do not know why I am crying. I should just go home." Caroline sat down beside her. "I used to say that too," she said quietly. "I should just go home, back to the person who made me feel this way, because I thought there was nowhere else to go." The woman stared at her. "But there is always somewhere else," Caroline continued. "There is always a way out. Sometimes you just need help finding it." She reached into her bag and pulled out a business card. "Webb Thornton Law, Advocacy for Domestic Abuse Survivors. If you ever need someone to talk to," she said, "call this number, day or night." The woman took the card with trembling hands. "Thank you," she whispered. Carolyn nodded and walked back to her son. As they headed home, Will's small hand in hers, she thought about the road that had brought her here. The pain, the betrayal, the moments when she had wanted to give up, but she had not given up. And because she had kept fighting, she was still standing. "Mama okay?" Will asked, looking up at her. Carolyn smiled down at him. "Yes, baby," she said. "Mama is okay." The sun disappeared behind the buildings, and the streetlights flickered on one by one, and Caroline Webb walked forward into a future she had built with her own hands, leaving the shadows behind her at last.